Okay, it is 1 minute before 10, but as the audience is rearing to go, we might as well start. I'm delighted to be here tonight. My name is Randall Hansen. I'm Director of International Partnerships here at the school, and I was Director of the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies for a decade. And we're here tonight to launch a brilliant book. But before we do that, I want to step back a decade. It's November 2016. No leaves in the trees, and I'm walking around in a daze. Because no sooner had I survived one punch, crawled back up, that punch being Brexit, Trump was elected. Second punch, down I go. I aroused myself, and I've got 300 applications on my desk that someone put there in the meantime for a job in West European politics. So I'm reading through these. One catches my attention. I read it, and I call Professor Schatz, Ed Schatz, the current director of CEAS, and I say, Schatz, we've got this crazy German who wants to work on housing. Well, how wrong I was, both about the candidate, now my colleague, and about the topic. Now, in his role as director of the Joint Initiative in German and European Studies, Alexander Reisenbichler has played an exemplary role at CEAS. Indeed, without him and Rob Austin, who was next to him, CEAS would collapse. He's played an equally distinguished role in the Department of Political Science. That's administration. He's also a remarkable scholar, associate professor of political science at UTM. His research focuses on comparative political economy in Western Europe, chiefly Germany and the United States, with a focus on housing, finance, and labor markets. The book we'll talk about tonight is barely out, just hot off the presses 2 months ago, and it's already received laudatory reviews. His other work has appeared in leading academic journals, such as Comparative Political Studies and Comparative Politics. We tenure people who never managed to get into either, and in public-facing outlets such as Foreign Affairs. So I was wrong about the candidate, now my colleague. I was equally wrong about the topic. For what Alex presciently realized when he started his postgraduate studies at George Washington in DC is that housing is at the foundation of the core questions of our day. Wealth inequality, intergenerational inequality, productivity, immigration, and the resurgence, and in some countries already the triumph, of the far right. Now, this impressive book captures all of that and more, but alas, it's not my job to discuss it. Rather, we have a highly distinguished panel, which I will briefly introduce, and then we'll move on to the event itself. Karen Chapple is a graduate of Berkeley, where she taught for many years and where she remains Professor Emerita. Here at Toronto, she is director of the School of Cities and a professor of geography and planning. She has many accolades, including most recently the 2023 Regional Studies Association Sir Peter Hall Award for lifetime contributions to her field. Her publications include Planning Sustainable Cities and Fragile Governance. Richard Deeg is a graduate of MIT, and he's currently the Christopher M. Barnett Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and professor of political science at Temple University in Philadelphia. He, like Alex, is a specialist in German and European political economy, and he's held distinguished fellowships at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Sciences in Cologne and the WZB, the Institute of Social Sciences in Berlin. His books include Finance, Capitalism Unveiled, and several volumes on financial regulation and institutional change. Finally, Irene Galea, a graduate of Cambridge, is a Toronto-based reporter for the Globe and Mail. She covers telecommunications, real estate, and corporate finance, and she's host of the award-winning urban design podcast, City Space. She's reported from 5 countries, including when we came into contact with each other, most recently as a 2024 Arthur F. Burns Fellow in Berlin. Now, before I hand the floor over to Alex, let me say something about our sponsors, CEAS and GIGIS, with support from the DAAD and the German Foreign Office, the School of Cities, the UTM Department of Political Science, and the Center for the Study of the United States at Munk. In terms of format, Alex will speak for 25 to 30 minutes and not 1 second more. And then we'll move over to 8-minute discussions, and then we'll open it to questions and answers. So I give you Alexander Reisenbichler, my colleague and my friend.
Okay, so thank you very much for the kind and indeed touching introduction, Randall. And thank you also to all of our sponsors for supporting today's event. I'd also like to thank all of the panelists today for being here and for having taken the time to read and comment on the book. And I very much look forward to your thoughts later today. Thank you also to everyone in the audience for coming out today, for learning a bit about the book and also celebrate its publication. It truly means a lot to me that all of you are here today. So writing this book has been quite a journey, and I'd like to take the opportunity to also thank my colleagues, Randall Hansen, of course, and also Darius Ornstein, where's Darius? There, for having read an early draft of the book and providing comments. So the book has undoubtedly improved, although I'm not claiming that it's by any means perfect, but it is better than it was before for all of your hard work. And I'm very grateful for your feedback. And this speaks to a bigger point that I wanted to make today, and we don't say these things often enough, is that I'm very grateful to be working at CEAS and also the Political Science Department, which has been very supportive of my work. And I would also like to say that it's very difficult to imagine a more intellectually stimulating and fun place to work at than where I currently am. And most of all, Yona is also here, my partner, and I'm very grateful to you that you've listened to every single setback and breakthrough of the book, probably way too many, and also for offering feedback and advice, as well as perspective when I needed it the most. So thank you very much to all of you. Before I start and get into the weeds of the book, though, I wanted to say just a few words about what motivated to write me the book in the first place. And so that was actually the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, which really triggered my interest in housing and how governments actually shape housing markets. And I found that there was a lot of intriguing variation across countries that have not been explained very much in the literature. So I was struck by how countries have also struck very different balances between supporting home ownership markets or rental markets, between making access to credit very easy or very difficult. And those are the questions that have motivated me to get into this research project. It also made me reflect on my own housing experience when I grew up in the East German city of Leipzig in the 1990s and in the 2000s, where housing was incredibly cheap and affordable. And for us as a family, for my single mom and for myself, it was very much a ticket to enter the middle class. Whereas on this side of the Atlantic, of course, entering the middle class is very much synonymous with the idea of home ownership. Right? Again, intriguing differences that I wanted to know more about. And so when I then finally got started on the topic in political science, as Randall mentioned, there was really not that much work done on housing. And a lot of my colleagues actually asked me, how is any of this political science? Isn't this an apolitical, technical, sort of financial topic? Well, nobody asked me that question anymore. Housing is now a top political priority on both sides of the Atlantic. In his first State of the Union address, or Regierungserklärung auf Deutsch, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz said that housing is one of the most important social questions of our time. And this comes from a guy who's sort of the business type conservative leader of Germany, not particularly known for his social policy ambitions. And he's really joined the chorus of German politics, ranging from the left party to the market liberal Free Democrats, all of whom have uttered these exact same words, housing being the social question of our time. On the other side of the Atlantic, we have, of course, just witnessed a remarkable election in New York City, where New Yorkers elected Zoran Mamdani as their next mayor. And he was in part elected because he promised to address the housing affordability crisis in New York with a slogan called "Freeze the Rent." So housing, in short, moves people, housing moves politicians and forces politicians to respond to housing affordability crisis today. And again, as Randall mentioned, housing is at the heart of and a driver of economic inequality. And let's not forget, it's also one of the largest economic sectors, one of the largest asset classes in the world with the potential to wreak economic havoc. So this brings me to the book. And the premise of the book is that housing is a deeply political issue. And housing is not just a deeply political issue in the sense that it's now a top political priority. It's also a deeply political issue because governments are deeply involved in housing markets. I mentioned it. Some countries prioritize subsidizing home ownership over renting. Some countries have prioritized rent controls over free market rents, or facilitating access to credit or restricting access to credit. And there's a lot of variation across countries that I wanted to explore. And I did so by comparing the United States and Germany, two global economic powerhouses, by asking the following question. What explains the different housing policy trajectories in the United States and Germany? And in the book, I do compare and I go into the political history of major housing programs in Germany and the US over the past 100 years. So in that respect, the book is also meant to be a resource for politicians, for policy experts, and sort of housing nerds interested really in the political history of housing programs. So that I view this as a descriptive contribution of the book. So what do I mean by housing programs? The book mainly focuses on housing finance programs that actually support financing the cost of building a home or acquiring a home. So tax programs, mortgage subsidies, also social housing programs. But I also dabble into questions of rent control and land use regulation, although perhaps not enough because there's only so much you can do in one book. And in terms of the method that I chose for the book, was that I went to several archives on both sides of the Atlantic, and I also interviewed politicians in the Bundestag, in Congress, and other high-profile functions in government. And I did this in order to get a look behind the scenes in terms of what their real motivations were when it comes to making housing policies in the two countries and also beyond. I do talk about other cases in the conclusion of the book as well. And so you might think, why is Germany and the US a good comparison to be looking at? Well, there is a puzzle emerges when you compare the two countries. Actually, two puzzles emerge. The first one is that both countries have adopted or developed very, very different housing finance models. The United States is famously known to be the land of the free markets, the free market economy, with an expectation of relatively limited government involvement in housing markets. Yet that's simply not the case when you look at housing in America, one of the largest sectors in the American economy. In fact, the US government has developed one of the most generous policy architectures for supporting housing finance in the advanced, rich, democratic world. So I call this a government-sponsored housing finance model. And I call it that way because the US government provides billions of tax dollars for homeowners, subsidizing homeownership. And more importantly, it also offers trillions of dollars in government guarantees on American home mortgages. So the American government currently is behind 70% of mortgage debt in the American economy. So this is quite huge. The system is also characterized by easy access to credit. And of course, all of this government support goes into the home ownership market and almost nothing into the rental housing market. The rental housing market support for it remains nothing more than a footnote in the American political economy. And if you don't believe my characterization, maybe you believe that of The Economist, which has called the American model a form of comradely capitalism, so kind of a form of socialism. And it also says in the subtitle here, you can probably read it, that America accidentally nationalized its mortgage market. Well, I will argue today that it wasn't so accidental, that there were reasons, structural reasons that led the US on this policy path. In contrast, Germany is a social market economy where the expectation is a much deeper role for the government in markets. And yet we see the complete mirror image of what the United States has developed. Germany has what I call this limited government housing finance model, where you have very few tax breaks for homeowners or rental markets alike. You also have relatively a marginal credit program, so there are no large-scale government guarantees in the mortgage market. There are, of course, some smaller programs by the KfW, the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau, but they pale in comparison to the United States. And of course, Germany also has a relatively strictly regulated mortgage and rental market, which is, again, stands in stark contrast to the United States. And I think the puzzle becomes even more intriguing when you look at the historical dimension of all of this. And that's because both countries started out in relatively similar places, meaning that the role of the government was fairly dominant in both the United States and Germany in the mid-20th century. Yet in the United States, policymakers and the country itself embarked on a path of policy expansion over the past 100 years. So state dominance there, or the sort of relatively dominant role of the government, started in the Great Depression in many ways as a response to the Great Depression, and then where policymakers adopted strong government support for home ownership markets. And over time, this government support increased time and again. Germany's policy path was one of policy retrenchment over time. That means that the state was also fairly dominant in the German housing market in the mid-20th century, especially in the post-World War II years, when German policymakers adopted very strong support for rental markets, social housing in particular, and home ownership markets in those years. But then starting in the 1970s, this policy course was reversed, and by the 2000s, most of these major housing programs have been eliminated. And so this is sort of the puzzle I'm delving into. And of course, other scholars have fruitfully looked at American and German housing, not necessarily in terms of the puzzle that I lay out, and they have emphasized the different roles of culture, they have emphasized the different roles of urban legacies, and they have emphasized different roles of welfare traditions, all of which have a lot of merit, and I'm not discounting those arguments in the book. But what I wanted to do in the book is to make a political economy argument and tell a political economy story about housing in both countries. So the core argument of the book is that housing plays fundamentally different roles in German and American capitalism. So, and as a result, what policymakers believe to be good economic and good housing policy differs across the countries and has put policymakers on a very, very different path in terms of these housing policy trajectories that I mentioned. The United States economy is service-oriented and demand-led, very much focused on credit and consumption. And I argue in the book that housing is exactly the kind of sector that can stimulate domestic demand through credit and consumption. So American housing programs often have had the objective to stimulate housing demand, which in turn stimulates or protects at least property values, which in turn stimulates housing credit, which again in turn stimulates private consumption. And so it's the kind of virtuous circle that keeps housing at the core of the American economy, although this cycle can also turn vicious, as we've seen during the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. It is therefore also not surprising that American homeowners treat their homes frequently as credit cards or ATMs, by borrowing against their homes to finance consumer spending, healthcare, education, to start a business, or other things out of their, capitalizing home equity in this way. So I would go as far as to say that housing finance is a kind of national champion in the United States. A national champion in the way that it's a strategic sector to create prosperity and growth, at least in the eyes of policymakers. And of course, the story is very different in Germany. The national champions there are still high value added manufacturing firms, and German homeowners also, the practice of leveraging your home to finance consumer spending is unheard of, right? Germans don't think about housing this way. So the German economy is still famously known for its high value added manufacturing industries, and it's very much export based. That means that domestic demand, credit, and consumption is way less important to the German economy than it is to the American economy. And so as a result, housing is not a key engine of growth, and policymakers also never frame it that way. Housing also always housing programs have always had a fundamentally different objective in the German case. It was always much more about creating affordable housing, creating price stability in the market as opposed to price appreciations, and also to be in a kind of supportive role for German industries in order for industries to recruit workers and limit wage growth. So in many ways, and I'll go into the details a little bit here, the objective of German housing programs has been more anti-inflationary, and it has been there to support the role of industries in the economy. And I'll get into this in a moment. Let's talk a little bit about whether policymakers actually believe the argument that I just laid out to you in some brief detail. So as I mentioned, the American story starts in the Great Depression. The Great Depression was, by the way, also a massive housing crash. So for the FDR administration, housing was both the disease, but also the cure in order to get the American economy back on track. So New Deal housing programs, and those were, again, credit and tax programs for homeowners, were intended to stimulate the American economy and get the Great Depression out of its misery, so to speak. And again, New Dealers were very explicit about that this should be done through supporting homeownership and not through public housing. And that's because stimulating these homeownership markets in ways that I just mentioned has ripple effects and cascade effects to the economy, at least in their eyes, whereas public housing just doesn't have that kind of ripple effect. And therefore, public housing was still relatively limited during that time. I should also mention that, of course, racialized minorities were excluded from that new housing model that emerged in the United States, which has now started and then also perpetuated intergenerational, not just racialized wealth inequality over time. And what's perhaps interesting to some of the housing nerds in this room is also that the American state helped establish the 30-year fixed rate mortgage, the beloved 30-year mortgage in the United States, which we don't really see in many other countries. And that's because the American state absorbs a lot of risk in financial markets through its government programs, which allows banks to offer this sort of product that it otherwise would not offer. So take away the government, you also take away the 30-year mortgage, fixed rate mortgage in America. And so these programs were actually, many of them were intended to be temporary. But as the saying goes, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. And these programs stuck around. And they stuck around not just because they were popular among voters, they also stuck around because they were very much complementary with the American system of capitalism, because they stimulated consumer debt, they stimulated home construction, and they brought about a whole set of new homes, so the Levittowns here, as you can see on the upper left, new homes that then also created new demand for consumer goods like TVs, refrigerators, radio sets, and all of these things that were new at the time. So housing. So I argue in this early chapter that housing construction and consumer spending became sort of the bedrock of American capitalism in the post-war period. And here you can see just a chart. You kind of have to trust me on the numbers here because you probably can't see it. But what it shows is that there was simply not much of a role for the American government before the Great Depression. And after the Great Depression, by the time you get to the 1950s, 45% of all mortgage debt was guaranteed by the American government. So the American government was backing 45% of the entire mortgage market, right? So that's kind of a tremendous number. And the story continues. And again, Mariner Eccles, who was FDR's housing architect and later also the Federal Reserve chair, put it the following way about New Deal programs. A program of new home construction launched on an adequate scale not only would gradually help put those men back to work, but would act as the wheel within the wheel to move the whole economic engine, right? So again, housing at the center of the American economy. Now contrast that with Germany in the early years. In Germany, of course, in the years after World War II, Germany faced a massive housing shortage of 4.6 million homes. So of course, the government needed to step in and support the construction of new housing. And this has been well documented in the literature too. My addition to it is that they did so with sensitivity to the German economic model at the time. And what that means, I'll go over in the slide. So it's well known that the Adenauer government established social housing programs, which were housing programs for rental and also homeownership housing. They established tax subsidies for rental and owner-occupied housing, and also strong rent controls, because the little housing that was available would have simply been too expensive for people to pay for, and it would have been inflationary. And so how is this linked to the German economic model? It's linked to the German economic model in two ways, because policymakers were very, very attuned to the fact that plants in Germany were operating under capacity. So they technically could have ramped up production, but the problem was there were labor shortages because of housing shortages. So workers couldn't get to work because there were housing shortages in industrial areas. So the Adenauer government and also the German Länder emphasized building affordable housing in industrial hotspots so that workers could actually get to work, and and productivity and production could be ramped up again. So the first aspect, how it actually reinforced the German model at the time, was through labor mobility and through increasing productivity. And the second point is that housing programs at the time were also intentionally designed to boost industrial competitiveness. And what I mean by that is that rent controls and also affordable housing and social housing programs were designed to contribute to price and wage stability, so that workers don't demand more in wages if they have affordable housing, that they don't demand more in pensions if they have affordable housing. And in that sense, price stability could be achieved. And again, policymakers were explicit here, and I'll show you a quote by Ludwig Erhard about this. So what I'm trying to say here is that housing programs were more than just housing programs. They were also de facto industrial policies and also wage policies in this period that contributed to the economic miracle in Germany in the 1950s and 60s. And you can actually see something, or maybe you can't, but I'm going to tell you what you should be seeing here is that housing construction numbers were actually very high in the 1950s to 1970s, up to 500,000 to 600,000 homes a year. Today, we're below 300,000, just to give you a sense of the scale. And half of all new German housing construction was social housing. So you can see the magnitude of all of this, that 6 million out of 12 million total homes were social housing. And that, of course, had a huge effect on housing affordability for decades to come. And so was this really designed that way? So let's have a look at Ludwig Erhard here. He gave a speech in front of, or two property owners, the property organization Haus und Grund in 1951. And he was deeply dissatisfied with the state of housing at the time. He said housing was a form of capitalism that does not deserve the name. And he said this because there was so much rent control in the housing sector. There was too much social housing in the sector. And he had also liberalized other sectors from price controls, just not housing. And then he goes on to lecture the property owners and said, the competitiveness of our German economy can only be guaranteed if we're able to keep our German price level somewhat stable, while boosting exports is the fateful task of our people. So he basically said, you guys have to make sacrifices because you have to forego profits because price stability is more important than making profits from being a landlord at the time. Okay, so it stands in stark contrast to Mariner Eccles, right? The wheel within the wheel to keep the economy going, domestic demand. Here it's all about exports, and housing has to be assisting that macroeconomic objective. I now come to the 1970s in the United States, which was a period in which American policymakers kept expanding housing support. Okay, so that, and the country, as all of you know, like any other advanced economy at the time, experienced post-Keynesian challenges of high inflation, unemployment, deficits, stagnant wages, and so on. And the response was almost predictable. It was, well, let's try to expand housing programs and stimulate more credit and consumption. And there was, again, bipartisan support for these kinds of initiatives. And excuse me, I'm getting a little bit technical in this part of the talk. So on the one hand, what policymakers did was to deregulate the mortgage industry, right? So the American mortgage market up until this point was very boring. It was based on savings and deposits, and those savings and deposits were used for mortgages for other people, right? So this is how the American mortgage system worked. So Carter, Reagan, and other presidents started to deregulate this because the savings and loan industries came under intense pressure from rising interest rates. Okay, that was the technical part. So we've managed that. And what policymakers then did was to create a whole new source of mortgage funding. And that was government-sponsored housing bonds, mortgage-backed securities, that then took over this boring deposit-based system. And all of a sudden, the American economy slowly was based on mortgage-backed securities for funding American mortgages. And it's a bit of a paradox. Again, on the left side, you can see that, you know, all these deregulatory efforts that Reagan was talking about and others were talking about, they were supposed to get the state out of the housing market. And yet the paradox is it got the state even deeper into it, because the mortgage-backed securities market was dominated by the American state with government guarantees, and then state involvement increased quite dramatically. It was also this period that turned American homes into credit cards, so homeowners borrowing against their homes, and the Washington Post saying that home equity loans have become the cocaine of the financial world. In Germany, the story was different. They did not financialize the market. Housing programs there were starting to reverse course. Housing programs were no longer seen as economic solutions, but as structural problems. And there's two reasons for this. In the post-Keynesian era, policymakers now thought that housing programs contributed to fiscal deficits and also channeled capital away from manufacturing firms. And also housing supply shortages were overcome. So they thought we're done with the problem here. So there, you know, there's no more shortages, so we don't need to do much more. And the response was to withdraw housing support. Reunification was the second part that led to the reversal. While we do see that reunification brought about a short-lived housing boom and then also boom, it also brought about a massive bust in East German housing, right? So Chancellor Helmut Kohl was trying to stimulate the East German economy through housing because, you know, East German industries were not competitive, and he needed a growth strategy for East Germany. So housing was a good way to do this, until it wasn't. And it left East Germany with 1 million vacant homes. House prices crashed, you know, and this is why Leipzig, when I grew up, was kind of a cheap place to live in and rent it. So you can see that also, this is one of the Plattenbau, GDR prefabricated homes. It was, were demolished. And it's ironic because Chancellor Kohl spent so much money on building new housing, and just a couple of years later, you spent federal money to demolish housing. Yes. Anyway, so I'm coming towards the end in terms of the final points of the talk, which is that the financial crash of 2008 and 2009 in the US wrecked the US economy. And you would think, well, this is a great opportunity to finally reform the American housing system. And this is what happened, right? No, the response here was to double down on what was already there and to kind of blow it up to astronomical proportions. So there was a continuation of the tax breaks, but more importantly, President Bush nationalized some of the world's largest mortgage companies, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And unlike AIG, for example, which was quickly nationalized and then released to the private market, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac still remain nationalized until this day. And this was in many ways bipartisan. It wasn't just President Bush, it was President Obama, President Biden, also Trump 1, and now Trump 2 is trying to privatize it, but he's having problems. And that is because fiddling with the American mortgage market is risky because it's so central to the American economy. The risk is that you drive up mortgage costs and that you hurt the economy and also homeowners. So I'm not going to read this quote by President Bush here, but the point is to see that over 95% of mortgage-backed securities are today issued essentially by the American government. And this is one of the largest asset markets in the world, a kind of safe asset like a US Treasury bond. And again, the Germans responded very differently to their own systems threatening crisis. When Germany in the 2000s was the sick man of Europe, high unemployment, slow growth, high deficits, and of course this housing slump that I just mentioned, the response was to eliminate housing programs. Federal social housing programs were eliminated by the Grand Coalition under Chancellor Merkel. Home ownership subsidies were also eliminated in the same year. And this all happened against the resistance of the housing lobby. So again, housing programs were seen as part of the problem, not the solution, driving deficits, channeling capital away from manufacturing sector, and also demographic projections were dire. At the time, the Statistische Bundesamt, the Federal Statistics Office, predicted 75 million German inhabitants today. And of course, now we have 84 million, right? So this is something very important. You can see that housing construction is at a very low point, especially social housing construction, at around 20, 30, 40,000 units a year. At its peak, it was 450,000 in West Germany alone. Okay, I'm coming to today's conclusion, so to speak. Today's housing affordability crisis present two paradoxes here. One is what I call a failure of omission in the United States, the omission being that you simply have not done enough to support affordable rental housing, which remains a footnote in the American political economy. And it's again a paradox here because all these housing policies that are intended to stimulate the American growth model can also paradoxically undermine that growth model because it tends to create housing bubbles, it tends to create overshoot. And today it has entrapped American policymakers in the status quo. Everyone feels uneasy about the status quo, from policymakers, even interest groups, to central bankers. You ask anyone, they would say, if we could start again, we would do the whole thing very, very differently. In Germany, I would call it a failure of commission. And that means that policy retrenchment deprived the country of the tools to tackle today's housing affordability problems, another form of policy overshoot. And today, this really undermines the German model by exacerbating skill shortages, hurting apprenticeship systems, hurting the Mittelstand, and also by driving up wages. So if I were to advise Chancellor Merz, I would say it's not just a social question, it's also the economic question of our time. And finally, we can go into this in the Q&A. Governments have come up with insufficient efforts to tackle the housing problems today. Let me go into the main lessons and then I'm actually done, Randall, I promise. So I just want to conclude by saying that housing crises, no matter how bad, can be solved, but it's a matter of political will. We have solved housing crises far worse than today's with smart policy and with political will. And capital was also scarce back then. Affordable and climate-friendly housing requires a very strong role of the state. And I think you need to go big. The policy patchwork we have seen in Germany, for example, is not going to work. Merz's Bauturbo, as he called it, the construction turbo, is likely not going to work. For Germany specifically, framing housing as a national economic issue has been much more fruitful than to say it's a social question. And that's because if you call something the social question, you relegate it to social policy. And ambitious social policy programs today are dead on arrival in a country that is still obsessed with balancing budgets. So call it, a national economic issue, support the Mittelstand, support the economy, and also, of course, it's a social question. I agree with that, but it's more than that. And finally, in the United States, this is my last point. I would advise one of the implications of the research is that the US government has to shift government support from home ownership to affordable rental housing. And that is, when you look at government guarantees, they're 90% home ownership, 10% rental market. And I think this is a thing that is actually doable. It won't happen overnight, but I think this is the direction that the United States should take. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention.
Great, thanks very much, Alex, for a fascinating talk. Ask the discussants to come up and we're going to start with Richard, right? Yeah. Great. Richard, do you want to speak from there? As you like. I think either works.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Alex for inviting me to participate in this panel. When he asked me, I said, I went over to the dark side 10 years ago, and I haven't kept up with the field as much as I used to. But he took a gamble on me, and hopefully won't be disappointed with the result. I want to divide my comments into three kind of segments. The first is to say a little bit about what I find extremely valuable in the book, and a few things I wished might have been in the book. And then I want to talk a little bit about how I think his work applies to the current and kind of near future state of the American political economy. And then third, the same thing, kind of how it applies to the current state and future of the German economy. If you read the book, I think the first thing that comes across is it is richly and deeply researched. Lots of original source material here. And this is the kind of work that doesn't necessarily happen that often. That alone, I think, is going to make it a valuable reference work for really years, if not decades to come in comparative political economy. The other thing that Alex does in the book is he embeds this in the growth regime literature, which has sort of evolved out of the varieties of capitalism and the comparative capitalism literature that really kind of prevailed, I would say, from the mid-90s until 10 or so years ago. And what the growth regime literature does is it sort of accepts the premises about the important institutional complementarities between welfare regimes, labor market regimes, and financial models in terms of constituting specific kinds of capitalism, and adds on to that the role of macroeconomic policy as an important element that defines different models of capitalism. Hence, you get Germany being a very different kind of capitalism than American over a rather long period of time, or what he calls an export-led regime in Germany and demand-led regime in the case of the United States. The other valuable thing I think that his argument does is it allows him to explain how the US, in the case of housing, runs completely against type, and that it ends up with a nationalized market in a country that's otherwise totally embraces sort of market liberalism. And so in doing it, gives us a richer understanding of the path dependencies in both countries. And in this, there really is a very powerful path dependency argument. I mean, it goes back basically almost a century in both countries and shows how over time they continue to double down, so to speak, or continue to follow a particular approach. Now, you mentioned the kind of a culture as an alternative argument, and I'm against kind of broad cultural arguments, but there is something very important in your book that's in there, but you haven't really theorized it and pointed to, and that is really the role of kind of hegemonic paradigms and dominant ideas and social norms. In fact, in your very conclusion, you mentioned the idea of how housing was getting reframed in Germany. And I think that's something that's very much a part of the argument. And I wish you had focused a little bit more theoretically on how those framing arguments help shape policy choices at critical points in time. And it's not just dour Germans with the very conservative attitudes about money, although that is true. And it is sort of part of it. But I don't think your argument needs to reside on that. The other thing that is, it's very, very clear is you make some references to order liberalism and Keynesianism. I think you could have also made a little bit more out of that in terms of how those are both dominant policy paradigms, certainly for a long period of time. And particularly a strong anti-inflation bias that was embedded in that order liberalism paradigm. The other thing, I wish you had done, in some ways that's unfair to say this to you because the book is rich and you can only do so much in a book. So maybe in current or future work you would do this, but I think there's so much potential here to draw out theoretical implications for the whole historical institutionalism literature. And as I said, there's a very strong path dependency argument here. I think you could delve back into this and look at what are the mechanisms of reproduction of these paths over very long periods of time. And in particular, you point to the fact that in 2008, 2009, with a collapse of the American market, it fits most of the conditions for what we call a critical juncture, right? A moment when you thought if you would ever change the American path of this demand, consumer-driven, it might have happened then, yet it doesn't, so it's fascinating. I would love to see you delve into that. In terms of where we're at now, Trump 2.0, my casual read in the American housing market is that it's kind of in a funk right now. Prices are up. Housing starts are down, there's pent-up demand, mortgages are high. So there's not a lot of refinancing. The home is credit card is kind of on hold now because it's you can't refinance. Many people sit on low interest rates. They can't refinance now. So that dynamic is kind of stuck, so to speak. And Trump seems to be doing things that are actually undermining this American tradition of using housing to promote consumption, right? Tariffs on Canadian lumber, that doesn't help lower housing costs, right? And that probably speaks to some folks in the room, right? Deporting labor, a lot of the people who build homes in America are immigrants, legal and illegal immigrants, right? Trying to undermine the kind of global free trade, which I think is a really important aspect of America's demand-led consumption that allows relatively cheap goods to come in. So he seems to be doing a lot of things that actually run against this. On top of that, you have all these climate disasters that are growing problems in the United States. I mean, many countries have subjected to natural disasters, but you've got tornadoes, you've got hurricanes, you've got hailstorms, wildfires across, and not just in coastal areas, but across much of the United States is driving up the cost of homeownership because insurance costs are getting so out of control, which also then drives down the home value. So you see a lot of dynamics here that again run against this idea of using homes as a source of liquidity and demand, yet I don't see a response to that. So what is Alex's book? Well, Alex's book tells us, Trump is an aberration. Let's hope. And when he's gone, this American promotion of demand led through the housing market will reassert itself. And I think you're probably right about that. But it also kind of begs the question, what would it take to change this trajectory? Over, from what it has been, or is it impervious, or is there something that could actually do that? Is it in some ways maybe connected to the relatively liberal global economic order of the post-war period that now seems to be eroding and Trump seems to want to accelerate? On the German side, I think you're right to point to the export fetishism, and I'll use the term deliberately, of Germany. For a very long time, it's almost a straitjacket in some ways. And I think you pointed out beautifully how the German approach to housing pivoted depending on whether promoting housing would help hold down wages and costs, or it actually or pulling back on housing support would hold on. But they're consistent, and their approach to housing is it's got to hold down costs, it's got to hold down wages. That's really consistent. I think you do a great job of showing that. My own reading of Germany right now is the kind of export model is under duress, right? For 15, 20 years, for most of America's period, the China market was huge, not only for the German car industry, but also machine tool industry, both exporting into it, but that seems to be running out. And the advantages again from the introduction of the economic monetary unit, which you also point to in the book, also I think are kind of petering out. So I think to me, Germany's entering maybe something of a critical moment. And I'm curious to know where it might go from here. In the final chapter, you point to kind of the Dutch and Swedish who pivoted to kind of a mixed model. And I wonder where your work would suggest Germany goes from here going forward. But just to conclude, I think both these are really interesting cases. I think, moving forward and working, you can really think about, in a more theoretical sense, how might these paths change? And that I think you answer by looking at that kind of underlying mechanism of reproduction, which is both about interests, but also ideas. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Richard. Perfectly on time. And over to Karen.
Great, thank you. As an urbanist by training, it's very exciting to see housing addressed from a political economy perspective. There's nothing really in the book, which is great, and please buy it, for a geographer or a planner to disagree with. But we would get to similar conclusions from a very different route, which I'll talk about in a moment. So the book is really eye-opening because it suggests entirely different ways for urbanists to understand policy and to construct policy. And it's at the macro level, not the city, not the region, not the province. And here we have national housing-based growth strategies on the US side and exports on the German side. we heard in the introduction that political scientists have indeed shied away from housing studies. The crazy German that works on housing.
That was one person's interpretation. I don't think that belonged to the field.
Yeah, so kudos to George Washington University for even letting a political scientist study housing. Although now there's a couple, I think. But the aversion to housing research has actually permeated urban planning as well. The U of T planning program doesn't even have a housing concentration. For most planning programs across North America, it's an afterthought, and for good reason, because any good regional planner who's studied the North Tibu debate about export and consumption-based growth knows that it's the economy that matters, stupid. They've read their Michael Storper. They understand if you want to understand location, you need to understand jobs, which drive housing, not the other way around. Policymakers know we have an income crisis as much as a housing crisis. But you're giving us some good reasons to revisit all of this, because you are showing how intertwined housing is with economic strategy. In fact, it is economic strategy, which is mind-blowing. So just one example of the insight that your work can give us with the comparative global perspective. In Canada, we make a lot of pilgrimages to Vienna. Anybody else been on the Vienna pilgrimage? So we go there because we know that social housing is a model there, and then we go and we talk to the city about it. But it's really Austria's export orientation, as you point out in your last chapter, that we should be looking at, not its urban policy. So I want to make two further comments about the book. And the first is about space, and especially the story of suburbanization, which is missing from your narrative. It's not even in your index. And the second is about the implications of your work for housing in Canada in particular. So from a geographic perspective, it's not really possible for us to understand a housing-based growth strategy aspatially, like we're on a featureless plane, in ways. So this national growth strategy that you're talking about is co-constituted by processes of suburbanization that are playing out across America and Canada too, for that matter. So those loans for new homeowners, those facilitate sprawling out into the periphery. And I almost want to evoke Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis here to show, North America is actually really different in this way from Europe, which has growth management policies in place which don't allow that sprawl. I'd like to introduce you to the research of my colleagues in geography and planning. First, Alan Walks, who you do cite, and most recently, Alex Reisenbichler, who's our newest colleague. Alex, in his dissertation, he looks at the consumption of mortgage debt, mortgage loans, and auto loans using individual credit score data. It's super cool work. He's actually speaking on our Knowledge Cafe, I think, next week or the week after. So what he shows is that the consumption of mortgage loan debt is making it possible for Americans to access home ownership, particularly in areas with low housing costs and low accessibility. In other words, out in the middle of nowhere where they drive till they qualify. And when they do that, they're consuming actually more auto loan debt along with a lot of mortgage loan debt. And so then he shows that there's this robust relationship between density and debt. As densities decrease, as we have sprawl, debt balances increase for both auto and mortgage loans, controlling for all sorts of factors. So urban form itself is driving debt consumption and is increasing it, particularly for the most vulnerable households. So I'm not sure we would see this kind of housing-based growth strategy right about, except that in these Anglosphere countries, we have this kind of sprawling land use pattern. Last on Canada. So I have a lot of questions. I'm just going to give you a couple. So you give us a taste of your thoughts on Canada at the end. You tell us this is actually, here we have a demand side homeownership strategy too. It's modified by a much stricter, a much more cautious regulatory structure. There's no mortgage interest tax deduction. There's no massive Fannie Mae intervention. But there is a lot of debt. And Canadians actually have more debt than Americans do. And so it raises the question of how much more destructive it will be in Canada if and when the bubble pops. It also raises questions about the rapid rise of inequality in Canada, which is catching up with the US fast. So that's one set of questions I have. And the other is on kind of on Carney and Build Canada homes. So there's a drumbeat in Canada on the need for significant new housing supply, 500,000 units a year. It's not just from the federal government. It's not just from the building industry. It's from grassroots, young YIMBY folks that have been cut out of the housing market. So, you know, in your opinion, and I don't know if you'll have time to answer this, but I would love to hear what you think. Should we not be building our way out of the problem? Can we afford in Canada to go the way of Germany or Austria, for that matter, given this level of need? Yeah.
Thank you, Karen and Irene.
Okay, thank you. My name is Irene Galea. I'm from the Globe and Mail. Vielen Dank für die Gelegenheit. Thanks for the opportunity. Es freut mich sehr, hier zu sein. I'd like to crystallize some of the insights from your research and the study of the policies and the history that brought Germany in particular to the point where they are now. I spent last summer in Berlin covering politics and housing. And one experience I had was I met with a young man named Amir who was renting in Berlin. And in the previous 4 years, he had had 4 disputes with his landlord, 3 over illegal attempts to raise his rent, and 1 because the landlord refused to fix a moldy wall in his bedroom that he could put his finger out and touch, and his finger would go into this moldy wet wall. And I asked, why didn't you leave? He said that the unfortunate reality is that to get an accommodation like he had, he would have to double his budget. And what that made me realize is that the cost of living in Berlin, although it is still cheap compared to many European centers and global centers, it has more than doubled in the last 10 years, and it's become a major social fault line. I spoke to many young people who had attended mass viewings of Besichtigungsunternehmen, where hundreds of young people would line up to see a single apartment, and only one person would get it, of course. And I witnessed the growing frustration at newcomers in Berlin. And that was a surprise to me, given Berlin's history as a politically liberal city. And ultimately, this fault line has resulted in changes to the political landscape. So how did Berlin get here? As Alex mentioned, vast availability of housing crash, and then in the 1990s, the city of Berlin sold about 1/3 of its social housing to private equity. And that trend continued after the 2008 housing crisis. And now many of those previously social apartments are not available for rent. And because there are fairly strong rental regulations, if you have an apartment, you can stay in it. But if you leave, then the landlord can raise the rent quite a bit. And I spoke to real estate agents who said that in the same apartment building, they had clients who were paying $600 and $2,000 for the same unit. And this has only become more strained in the last few years with several waves of migration, not to mention Ukrainian refugees in the city. And this has led to a rise in support for the AFD. So a study, a 2003 study published in Comparative Political Studies, found that in places where the rent was rising more quickly, there was an associated rise in support for Alternative for Deutschland, which is of course the far-right party in Germany. And to me, that is quite a concerning trend given the rise in populism that we see globally. And in order to regain some of those social units, there was an attempt to expropriate, a movement to expropriate some of those units back from private landlords, that resulted in a 2001 plebiscite vote, which was non-binding, but the majority of Berliners said that they wanted to buy back those units. Unfortunately, buying back those units at market rate would be about $30 billion. And that's, of course, an enormous cost. So what were my findings, my thinking coming out of that, and after having read your book, the effect on rising rent on political division is frightening to me. Especially, also this is a time when both Canada and Germany are facing the risks of population, a slowing population growth, and potentially in the future population decline. And when you have very expensive housing, or in Canada, housing that is very small and not accessible to families, it doesn't encourage family planning, population growth. In Germany now, businesses are saying we need cheaper housing because we can't get workers in the places that we need because it's become more expensive. And we saw something similar in Toronto, where Amazon considered Toronto as a base for its headquarters, but in the end they pulled out because it was too expensive. In terms of housing for their workers. Finally, I think it speaks to the lasting effect of urban planning decisions. And to the point on density, in North America, we chose to sprawl and build around highways, and we're still dealing with the effects of that. So Alex, I would ask you, given what you have found, given your findings, what would be your policy recommendations to the Canadian government to encourage affordable rentals? And I'll finish by saying I interviewed Justin Trudeau last year, and I asked him what his plan was to make more affordable housing without losing political support. And he said, I'll quote, "We need to keep housing stable and valuable, but we need to make sure more people can get into it," which is a contradiction. So how do you suggest that politicians deal with this inherent contradiction in Canada?
Thank you. Great, thank you very much, Irene. Thank you for 3 excellent responses. Alex, I'm going to make you hang on to all of that. Yes. And we'll open the floor to questions. Put up your hands. Tom?
Hi, Alex. This is such an exciting day. This book is really path-breaking. I have a question that picks up on something Karen said. And I know the American takes better here, but isn't the American story inextricably tied with a state-building story of racial demographic engineering, right? There's all of this fantastic work on the Homestead Act in the 19th century about providing and incentivizing white homesteaders to rush indigenous land, Mexican land, to prepare these areas for statehood. And then in the post-war era, you see the creation of the suburbs to escape the race riots, to create racially gerrymandered suburban congressional districts and the like. And so is it possible to sort of see this as a predominantly political economic story, or is this as much, or if not more, a story of racial demographic engineering by the American state?
Yeah, good question.
Great, and just while you gather your thoughts, I'd encourage the students in particular to ask questions. Let me tack one onto there. I read today in the Financial Times that Lagarde, head of the central bank, said that Europe is exporting to nowhere which is to say it has an export-based model for growth, Germany above all, but also Denmark and Austria, add Switzerland outside the EU, in a world of increasing tariffs. So you've done all this work on consumption versus export models. Is it time to switch? A rather more radical suggestion. Should Europe, which is an internal market of, what's it now that the Brits left? 450 million people, and they'll be back eventually. So eventually 500 million again, which is larger than that of the United States. Is it not possible to shift from an export model to a consumption model, which will solve the greatest question of the day, how Europe ends its stagnation? Yeah. One more question? Yeah, please.
Hello, Professor. Thank you. The book was phenomenal, but I had two questions to ask. The first one had to do with the book framing housing policy as a reactive force into like consequences like the Great Depression or the post-Keynesian oil shocks or the 2008 financial crisis. But what about during the phases? Was housing policy changing during this time? Yeah. Or was it more or less stagnant, like you say, if it's not broken, don't fix it? Second question, I think more in Germany in this case, but what about external institutions playing, like the European Central Bank, or if you want to go back more towards like the Marshall Plan, were there external forces that really laid pressure into how they shaped their housing market?
Excellent questions.
Do you want to respond to those, Alex? We've given you a lot, and then we can go on to the next round.
I'm not sure I have, but yeah. Okay, so since a student actually asked a question, I'm gonna take that one first.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cyrus, great question. So in terms of the external forces, you mentioned the German Marshall Plan. It was actually quite remarkable. What I found for Germany was that Marshall Fund plans were distributed for the German housing market to rebuild housing, but it was not to reward sort of political allies that have resisted the Nazis, for example. It was really, there was a letter from the head of the Marshall Fund that said, Marshall funds have to be used in order to increase the productivity of the German industry. And this is where those Marshall Fund funds should be going. So in that sense, it was actually kind of complementary to the story that I'm telling, but it's a very good question. And also, is housing just a reaction to crises? And this speaks to Richard's point of critical junctures, kind of, and then you're forced to react. It's both. It is definitely a reaction to these critical junctures, to these crises. But of course, these housing policies, they are being produced and reproduced in incremental steps and gradually over time within any given period, right? So then there's never stasis because, you know, the world around these housing policies moves on. And so that you have to adjust things. There are many unintended consequences too that I try to get at in the book, but it's a very good question. And may I now respond?
Oh yeah, please.
Well, thank you so much for all of these very insightful comments. And let me pick maybe one or two for each.
Actually doing well for time.
Okay, great. Then I wanted to start with Richard's point on, so, you know, the German model is under pressure and where should it be going? And I think, especially in this sort of new geo-economic order that you point out, right? And I think the best way for affordable housing to be produced is to include affordable housing into this narrative of geoeconomics. And that is by including housing programs as a way to support the German industries, because that is the new industrial strategy now in Germany, right? So to create these competitors in the global economy, these sort of new national champions. And I think that when you look at the infrastructure fund of the Merz government, housing is only, I think, maybe 3% of all of that. It's very, very little. And I think it could be more if you framed it in a way that raises the stakes of it. It's not just a social problem. It can actually help us compete in this new geo-economic landscape. And I think that would be one way for me to think about this. In terms of the mechanisms of reproduction, I mean, you're putting a finger onto something that I was actually always really intrigued by, which is the historical institutionalist narrative of policy feedback and so on. And I think it's a truly endogenous story, right? So we always stay away from endogeneity problems. Sorry for being nerdy in terms of political science language, but try to stay away from endogeneity problems of chicken and egg, you know, what causes what. But I tried in the book to really embrace it. You can't speak about one thing or the other. It's a kind of mutually reinforcing over time. And in the US, I really thought that one of the ways in which it's reproduced, for example, is that if you really do take away the government in a major way, then you are disrupting one of the key industries in the country. And that is why it's kind of like a third rail. You touch it and you kind of get burnt. And so I think that maybe making that into a mechanism and more eloquent mechanism in a different paper could be a way to do it. And on culture, that's a really good point on these hegemonic paradigms and debates. The one cultural aspect that I do talk about in the book that's perhaps interesting for the audience is that the Christian Democrats in Germany actually wanted to create some kind of nation of homeowners. You know, Adenauer and some housing policy experts in the 50s really wanted to create the same kind of thing that we do see in the US. So there was this push. But even Adenauer's own party, the CDU, at the local and regional levels, they said, you're out of your minds. This is not what we want in terms of how to rebuild the country. But there was this push towards it, and they defected from it. And I thought that was sort of interesting. There's more to be said. We can stay in conversation. I really like your comments. Thank you. Karen, yeah, you put your finger onto. Let me actually put your comments. Oh yeah, onto very important issues. Let me start with the one that I can better address, which is Carney's plan on building Canada Home, sort of this new government agency. Actually, when I first read about it, I thought, well, 13 billion, I think, right? That's actually kind of a lot of money. And then I looked into the details. So it's 13 billion over 5 years. So it is, just over 2 million a year. And I think that's not nearly enough to solve Canada's housing problem. And I don't claim to be an expert on Canada, but I wanted to say one more thing, which is that Canada did have a push for social housing. It's called differently here. It's sort of this more non-profit-based housing from the 1960s until the late 1980s. And I think this is something to perhaps build on and to revive, because I don't think that the solution to today's housing problems anywhere is to just build more housing. I think that you need to build more social housing, right? So you don't need sort of luxury condos in Toronto, for example. On Marley, we see all these condos going up that have these fancy gyms, these fancy amenities. People just want to live in an affordable place. And I think sort of social housing, non-profit housing, that is the kind of housing we need, and not just building housing. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think on suburbanization, I kind of want to make this, kind of maybe get into Tom's point there as well. Yes, that's absolutely correct. And I did show the Levittows, at least in the picture, and I do mention it in the book, but of course not as much as I should, so I completely agree with you. That it's a story of sprawl, right? And it's a major problem for the American housing market, for the American climate goals too, right? Because it's so not just inefficient, it's also so wasteful in terms of all the resources and the sprawl. And you have a very different planning process in Germany where, it's federalism. The federal government sets the guidelines, the federal states are much more involved in the planning with the local communities, and that's how you avoid the sprawling aspect. It's a great point, should have made more of that. But it brings me to Tom's points about the racialized dimension of this. And I do try to take that very seriously in the book. And I mentioned it also in the talk, although only in passing, that we moved sort of in the US from the story of racialized or exclusion, right? At least in the post-war period. So all that suburbanization, that was all white homeowners, white veterans, right? Only a fraction of Black veterans actually got these VA loan programs, which is, of course, dreadful. And then once racialized minorities were included, it was a form of predatory inclusion, right? So there's this wonderful book by Kinaga Taylor, Race for Profits, in which he shows that from the post-war, sort of from the 60s until the 80s, there were targeted programs, but they really drove racialized minorities into predatory lending. And as a result, they were still sort of excluded from the prosperity generating effects of the housing market. And then it brings us up to the financial crisis. And there's a lot of work on this, that the subprime crisis was also very much a racialized story, right? So all else equal, same credit score, same income, racialized minorities were more likely to get a subprime loan, holding everything else equal. And it's a sort of the story of America that it very much ties into housing and has produced this racialized wealth gap over time too, which is now still pronounced. So for example, I think the home ownership rate between white Americans, so the homeownership rate for white Americans is 70% in the US, and for Black Americans, it's just 45% or something. So it's still a huge gap. And of course, housing assets are the most important thing in terms of your personal wealth. And so, yeah, you know, I hope I got somewhere with my answer to this question.
You didn't answer my question.
Yes, sorry. The most important question, I remember it, on the EU changing growth models. That's a really good question. I don't have a good answer for it other than to say that we need to move, as Richard mentioned, move away from Germany's export fetishism, which is still a problem. It's not only a problem for the European Union or Eurozone, as it has been discussed during the Euro crisis. It's creating global imbalances. And I think in terms of diversifying your risk, focusing more on domestic demand, I think is not a bad idea. And you can see cases such as Sweden and the Netherlands who actually have made that shift a while ago, but they succeeded. And I think maybe there's something for the German government to, or the German elites, it's not just the government, right? It's the Bundesbank, the Council of Economic Experts, the Sachverständigenrat, usually all on the same page. And it's very frustrating to see. And I think, maybe some kind of rethinking would be allowed.
Yeah, I mean, it related to a conversation that I had with our colleague Daniel Mertens, another political economist. And he said in Germany, there's a distinction, which is ultimately an anti-Semitic distinction, between wealth that is generated by making something, a beautiful BMW, and wealth that is generated in the stock market or through rising house prices. And at the end of the day, wealth is wealth. It doesn't matter where it comes from. And indeed, these industrial jobs for which Trump is pining involved historically a huge amount of human misery, whereas a rising stock market doesn't require exploited labor. Of course, it's complicated. Some of the companies do, but you see the point that I'm making. So there is a world in which a controlled housing market moves people into the middle class, gives them a nest egg for pensions. So the problem isn't the housing market, it's the housing market that's gone out of control, correct?
I agree. And I also agree with Daniel's and your point on sort of the speculative elements.
Speculation is always.
Spekulanten. I mean, that is a very, very sort of derogatory term almost in Germany, whereas here you speculate in real estate and you're doing fine, good for you. You know, you've made a bunch of money. Whereas in Germany, that's you can't mention that at a dinner party. You know, you will be scolded.
Great, excellent. One last question? Yeah, please.
Maybe touching on Irene's point too. I mean, it's a story of divergence.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think we're recording. I should have said that before. Yeah, speak into the mic, good, please. My apologies.
Thank you. Congratulations, Alex. By the way, I mean, it is a wonderful book, and this was a great event. But just to end on a dour note, you know, the divergence is very well explained, but where we're at now politically with respect to housing is remarkably similar. I mean, you started off with Mamdani. It's an American problem. Irene mentioned Berlin. Affordability is a Berlin/Germany problem. Certainly a Toronto, Canada problem. It's not so much about the book, but how you see this as an expert on housing. How do these very different approaches lead to the same problem of our time, or one of the major problems of our time?
Not a very easy question to answer. Difficult, of course. But I want to, before I get to Phil's question, if you will allow me 1 minute to address Irene.
Sure, just package the two of you, of course.
And it sort of speaks to Phil's question too. So I completely agree that in Germany, there's this new fault line now between those who have secure housing and cheap housing and those who are trying to enter the housing market, whether that's owning or renting. And I think what's interesting about this is that back just not too long ago, you would be considered an outsider in the German economy if you had an insecure job, you know, atypical work and that sort of thing versus a secure type of job. And now I think there's an overlapping layer. So the job dimension is no longer enough. Now it's also about, do you have secure and cheap housing or do you not have that? And of course, it fuels a lot of resentment and frustration in the German population. And the AfD is capitalizing on that. And I think one way, again, to address it is to, again, make housing more affordable. I said the ways in which I envision that. And you would also take away support possibly from the AfD. But if you're Chancellor Merz and you say things like, you know, about the Stadtbild, about the cityscape, I don't know how many people of you have. So basically he said that people are dissatisfied with the diverse cityscape, with diversity in cities, so to speak. Code for foreigners from different countries. So that just kind of fuels, you know, support for the far right. I don't think it's just not a very smart thing. It's a very toxic thing to say. And I think the better way to do is to tackle these problems head on by simply solving the issue at hand and not make it about migration and blaming foreigners. And so, but I also wanted to also pick up on your other point about Justin Trudeau, because yes, it's a paradox what he said, but if you buy sort of the argument in the growth, the growth model argument about the book, it kind of makes sense what he says, right? A lot of Canada's economy rests on property and property doing sort of well and the housing market doing well. But on the other hand, again, you reach a point where it's very dysfunctional, right? So how do you get more affordable homes while not punishing, so to speak, property owners who just bought and then they have to, witness a drop in 20% in their home value? We just became homeowners too, so they have a stake in the market here, and it's very sad that all this self-interest is a very dominant part of this market. And so this brings me to Phil's question about how do we end up in the same place if we're going about it so differently? And I think we're both, and this is also a Canadian, US, and to a lesser degree maybe German story, but it's about sort of the supply side. Up until the 1970s, land use regulation in many countries was actually relatively liberal. You had these mega projects, you could build a lot, and not always in the best ways, of course, environmental damage and all of that. But building was easier. And after the 1970s, land use became much more restrictive. And that was partially because of NIMBYs, right? So not in my, you want social housing, of course, you're a good liberal, but just not next to you. And you're, and it's a real problem. And there are other considerations. Sometimes it's racism in some communities, sometimes it's historical preservation. And, there's so many things that are in the way, environmental concerns. You want to, save the frog. I'm sort of exaggerating that it's native to that specific part of land. And, there's sometimes value to these claims, but it makes building so much more difficult than it used to be. So NIMBYs are a big problem. And I really like the YIMBY movement now that is trying to overcome this to a degree. So Phil, I think that's part of the story. I think it also had to do a lot with central banking after the financial crisis, where interest rates were incredibly low, and so a lot of money went into housing, right? So that drove demand without keeping the supply up on the supply side. So those are the things that I would say. But of course, there's probably many other things at work, but I hope I could address the question to a degree.
Great, excellent. Well, thank you, Alex, for an excellent talk. Thank you, Karen, Richard, Irene, for wonderful interventions. Thank you, Phil, for ending on a note of pessimism. Our motto at CEAS is it can only get worse. And Irene, hang on, we're not done. Irene, I loved that story about Justin Trudeau. I can only I hope you got a good selfie at the end, which strikes me as the main benefit of any such interaction. Thank you for excellent questions. Food and drink is next door.